Hi, everyone. Today we are going to talk about irony, paradox, and ambiguity in literature. These are crucial to understand, and even though, like with paradox, you can't literally understand it because it's a paradox, and ambiguities intentionally defy common sense or logic in order to create um, a wider space in the work of literature for interpretation. Okay, so I want to start with types of irony because this is super important to understand. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger, in case you're reading this on or watching this on your phone. So a lot of the times people misunderstand what irony is and how it works. It's very easy to do this, and very often people will say that something's ironic when it's actually not. It might just be coincidental. So I want to go through probably the most important types of irony, and these are the ones that are going to show up most often in literature or film or art or whatever, just so you have a stronger sense of what's going on. So verbal irony, this is one of the most common types of irony. This is to be distinguished from sarcasm. Okay. For example, if I looked out the window right now and there was a tornado coming at me, which does happen sometimes, and I said, "Oh, wonderful weather we're having," that would be a type of verbal irony because nobody in their right mind would describe a tornado as wonderful weather. Um, a Another type of verbal irony that shows up, you might see it in Plato, for example, where Socrates will be talking to somebody who's clearly an idiot, and he will say, "Oh, you are most wise." And so, in saying it that way, okay, it creates verbal irony. The thing is that if we use inflection in our voice to say, "Oh, you're really smart," right? You can hear that. That's when it becomes sarcasm. So sarcasm is kind of like verbal irony's young, unsophisticated cousin. Okay, it does kind of the same thing, but without the punch that verbal irony carries with it. So the meaning of the sentence, the meaning of the phrase, the meaning of the gesture, okay, have to be in structural opposition to the actual intention. Okay. So like if I showed up to class or whatever, with two black eyes and my nose caved in, and somebody said, "You look great today, Dr. Helberg." Actually, I would hope somebody would ask, "Are you all right?" before using verbal irony on me, but I'll take what I can get most days. So this is just a type of irony. There's another one called dramatic irony. And this is very, very common in film. It's actually how film works, but also in fiction. Now, dramatic irony is where the characters don't know something about the world around them that the reader does. Okay? So it might be that you're watching a movie and you see a house and you see a tornado coming for the house, right? We cut to the next scene. Everybody inside the house is sitting down to have dinner. They are oblivious to the tornado. That creates tension. So the viewer of this movie knows that a tornado is about to hit the house, whereas the family inside is unaware of it. So that would be dramatic irony. You can see how most stories, most films, TV shows, whatever, have to work in this way. Okay, it's the central tension of, let's say, horror and comedy, because in both of those, the dramatic irony is used to show that the character inside of the text or the movie or the film, whatever, um, doesn't understand the kind of danger they're in, like in a horror movie, or doesn't understand that the world is composed very differently than what they assume. Okay, so There was a funny play by Beaumarchais, a French playwright, and I believe it was Marriage of Figaro. Where anyway, there's a woman cheating on her husband with another guy. I know this guy looks more child size, but let's just say that he's a tad short. And the husband came home and said, "Oh, where is he? I know you have a man in here. Show me him. Show me his cowardly face." And the woman says, "What? Oh, honey, what's wrong? Like, why are you always so angry?" Meanwhile, the guy she's cheating on her husband with is behind a chair. And, the audience can see him, but this character, the husband, cannot. And at one point, he actually walks around the chair, and the other guy just walks around the front of the chair, right? So the chair is always in between them, so the husband can't see him. And it's a very, very funny scene in the film. But that's dramatic irony. Situational irony, this is the one that a lot of people misunderstand. This is the one they call this irony when in fact they just mean coincidental. Okay, so in situational irony, the easiest example, the one I use all the time, is to imagine that I invented a drink that I say this drink will make me live forever. I drink it and then it kills me. So that's situational irony. You see that I intend for that thing to make me live forever, but it has the exact opposite effect. Now, when I say that a lot of people misidentify this, it's because of the structural function, okay? So the action, let's call it X, has to lead to the opposite, exact opposites of not X, okay? So I intend this drink to make me live forever. It not just makes me sick or whatever. No, it kills me. So you see that intention has to be oppositionally formulated. So there's a structure to how irony works. Okay. So a lot of people will look at certain situations and say, "Oh, that's ironic," and they just mean that it's coincidental. Funnily enough, there is a song, or was many, many years ago, called "Ironic" by Alanis Morissette, and she brings up a bunch of, you can go look at the lyrics, she brings up a lot of incidents in life that she says, "Oh, isn't this ironic? Isn't this ironic? Isn't this ironic?" None of them are actually ironic. Not a single example she gives in the song "Ironic" are actually ironic, which thus makes the song ironic. This was unintentional on her part, but if you go listen to the song or read the lyrics, you'll think, none of those are actually ironic, but the song's called ironic. Oh, wait, the whole thing is thus ironic. So irony can even happen by accident sometimes. There's another one called structural irony. Now, this is a much larger type of irony. It's actually kind of hard to see sometimes, and this is very common in the written word, very common in literature. Okay, so sorry, I'm getting text messages. Structural irony. So, for example, in the book, if you've read it, which you should have, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, there's a structural irony inherent to this book because the book opens up and we're on a ship, okay? And this character X is telling us a story that he heard from another person to whom the story actually happened. So you see, you have this kind of chain, this like larger structure that is being utilized. So here we have storytelling, right? Here we have the actual story taking place to this person at a certain point Z in the past. Now, why is this structurally ironic? Because two of the major themes in that text are truth and lies, right? So whenever we have a character retelling a story that happened to them, we have to take that with some grain of salt because it might be that the character is misrepresenting the things that that character did. Now, sometimes, in real life, it's an innocent type of thing. You ask your friend, you say, "Oh, what were you up to this weekend?" And your friend says, I was studying, I was reading poetry, I was writing poems, I was reading a lot of great literature, and in fact, they were just vegging out, sitting around, watching YouTube videos. Okay, so harmless white lie. There's no consequence to that. Well, in this book, the character Marlowe, he says this several times that he cannot stand lies. He hates lies. And yet, at the very end of the book, I'm not giving away a spoiler here, he actually ends up telling a very substantial lie in order to make somebody feel better. Okay? So he gives up, he abandons his moral principles of, I never lie, I believe in the truth. He abandons that in order to, right, assuage someone else's feelings. Now, there's a certain ambiguity to that. Is that a good or a bad action? Okay. But it's also a structural irony because we know that if he's capable of lying in this sense, how much of his story that we are now hearing from somebody else is actually true. So you see that there's a structural kind of irony to how that's formulated. And that's what makes it kind of interesting. Let me find my notes. Sorry, bear with me one moment. So there's another, now this is a little bit more esoteric, simply because it's not a text that I assume anybody has read, unless you're like a philosophy student. And I don't want to go too far into it. But there's a book by Plato called Parmenides, and Parmenides was a philosopher that predated Plato. He's called the philosopher of being, right? Ontology was a big concern to him. Now, the text of this dialogue, Parmenides, is notoriously thick. It is very hard to follow. Even if you know what they're talking about, it's still very, very convoluted. The language is just very, I'll read a little bit of it here in a minute. But the joke that Plato uses, the situational irony, is that this is a story that somebody heard from somebody else, from somebody else, from somebody else, from somebody else, from somebody else. So many, many, many times in the past, the story has been repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, so that now the person is telling us, a story that's 4 to 5 iterations in the past, and the language is really, really convoluted. So there's a structural irony to what Plato's doing here because, well, nobody's going to remember that text that well to be able to repeat it back. So is Plato kind of insinuating that, yeah, maybe some of Parmenides' stuff doesn't quite make sense? So you see that irony in this sense gets to both say the thing and oppose the thing simultaneously. Okay, so this is a structural type of irony. I'll give you an example of Parmenides' language here. Parmenides says this. Then the one will have being, but its being will not be the same with the one. For if the same, it would not be the being of the one, nor would the one have participated in being, for the proposition that one is would have been identical with the proposition that one is one. But our hypothesis is not if one is one, what will follow, but if one is, am I not right? Insofar as it is affected in the same way, it is not affected otherwise. And not being affected otherwise is not unlike, and not being unlike is like. But insofar as it is affected by another, it is otherwise, and being otherwise affected is unlike. Don't you agree? And then Socrates will usually just say, yeah, sure. This is the one dialogue in Plato that Socrates clearly loses. And at one point, um, Socrates just leaves. He's very young, and Parmenides is just running through all of these very convoluted arguments, and Socrates just kind of throws up his hands and just takes off. So kind of a funny little moment in that book. That's what we call philosopher's humor. Ha ha. So that's structural irony. Cosmic irony is a little bit different. This tends to have to do with things like the universe or the gods. Okay, like we think that we're important, and the universe says nope. We think the gods love us, and the gods say, "Who are you?" A good example of this comes from the Iliad, this book right here, one of the two major books by Homer, and one of the most important books in the history of literature. So Achilles' friend Patroclus has just died. Spoiler alert, Hector kills him. And Achilles' magical horses are crying because, of course, he has magical horses that can talk and cry. Zeus comes down and says, "What are you crying about? What's wrong?" And the horses say, "Oh, boo-hoo, Patroclus is dead." And Zeus actually gets kind of angry. And he says, "Why would you cry for mortals? They're the most pathetic creatures that exist because they know that they are mortal and therefore are pathetic in how they try to avoid their fate, etc., etc." So in that instance, it shows that Zeus, much like all the other gods, don't give a hoot about us. Okay? So there's a kind of cosmic irony. We want the universe to make sense. We want, the gods or whatever to care about us. And sometimes we see in the sense of cosmic irony that, well, that's just not true. Then we get down to stable versus unstable irony. Now, these are types of irony. These are not modes of irony like we have here. These were coined by a guy named Wayne Booth. You'll hear a lot of his vocabulary used in your literature classes. Unreliable narrator, for example, that comes from Booth. Stable versus unstable ironies, that comes from Booth. Now, a stable irony is an irony that we can look at and pretty much make sense of, right? The meaning is very clear. Unstable ironies tend to be a little bit more ambiguous. They tend to be kind of harder to really pin down. Like this structural irony from Plato, that's a stable irony because we can look at it and say, well, very clearly here's what Plato's doing. This kind of dramatic irony, that's a stable irony because it's very clear what's happening in that scene. Now, we see that we understand the characters, we understand the structure of that irony. Now, unstable irony is actually a bit more interesting in literature, and it's kind of hard to control sometimes, or kind of hard to interpret. Now, if you've ever seen the movie No Country for Old Men, or heaven forbid, read the book, it's a good book by Cormac McCarthy. In that book, there's a character named Anton Chigurh. I'll write out his name. So Anton Chigurh is the kind of embodiment of evil for that book. And the funny thing is, one of the unstable ironies of the character is that he has this very strange philosophy about fate, right? And determination and free will. So what he's trying to do is combine free will and fate. So what you'll notice is that his philosophy, if you watch the movie, his philosophy is actually nonsensical. It doesn't quite make any sense because he'll meet people and then he'll flip a coin and he'll say, choose heads or tails. So they have the illusion of free will. Okay, they have the illusion of free will, but if they get the coin flip wrong, he'll kill them. Okay. Now this happens several times in the book where he gives people a choice. He flips this coin and then says choose, and the person may choose right, they may choose wrong. Now, when you actually go in and unpack all of his philosophy, it actually makes no sense, right? There are serious inconsistencies, and there are inconsistencies in how he acts and how he behaves. Okay, obviously because he's insane. But that would be an unstable irony. Okay. Where's another unstable irony? If you go and read the book The Odyssey, okay, a lot of people think that the Odyssey ends with Odysseus being back home and with his wife again, Penelope, reunited. Now, that's not the end of the book. The end of the book, chapter 24, actually has Odysseus going back out on another journey. He has to go back out, right, on this journey that the gods have put him on. Okay, so this idea of Odysseus always being, called upon, always being in motion, never being at rest, creates a kind of unstable irony, considering that the entire book prior to that was him trying to get home. And then he has to set out again. Okay? There's a certain unstable irony in that kind of structural irony. Now, sometimes these ironies can overlap. You can have a structural and situational irony that can be kind of simultaneous. Okay? They can be the same thing. A structural irony that's also a cosmic irony. So these things do overlap. It's not like they can be, they just have this one characteristic. And once again, in Heart of Darkness, right, we have that idea of Marlowe saying that he admires Kurtz, but he also hates him, right? Marlowe hates lying, hates liars, but then he lies at the end of that book in order to make somebody else feel better. Now, you see how it's starting to get a little bit clearer, I hope, that the distinction between stable and unstable irony. Because if you say that, well, he shouldn't have lied because he hates liars and lying's bad, well, then that would have hurt the person he was talking to. So he does something bad and good simultaneously. It's bordering there on a paradox, which I'll come to here in a moment. But you see that these designations are actually pretty helpful to help us understand. There's another irony. This is one of my favorite. This is kind of a cosmic irony. And this is more or less a stable irony. So it's a cosmic irony. It's a structural irony. It is situational between these two books, between the Iliad, which came first, and the Odyssey. Because in the Iliad, Achilles is given a choice. One of the very few times in Greek literature that a mortal is given a choice by a god. And because Achilles has a goddess for a mother, Thetis. And she's talking to Zeus, and she says, oh, okay, well, give my son a wish. And Zeus says, well, okay, I'll give him one of two options. Right? He can go into battle at Troy and die a glorious death, and his name will live forever. Or he can go home and live a very long life with a loving wife and children, but his name will die in history. Nobody will remember. So Achilles chooses. He chooses the glory. Right? Because in Greek culture, and I won't go into this, that was an important thing called time and kleos. Well, in the Odyssey, which is the second book, Odysseus has to descend into Hades. Okay, he's looking for Tiresias, the blind seer. Well, along the way, he meets the ghost of Achilles. Okay, and he says, "Oh, hey, Achilles, what's going on? We miss you. We miss you up top. We sing songs about you and think about you all the time. How's it going down here?" And Achilles says, I'd rather be a landless slave than king of all the dead. Clearly, right, he made the wrong choice. So you see how it's a very stable irony. Like it's very clear, like, oh, okay, to be alive is way more preferable than being dead. Okay. So you see how that's easy to understand, so therefore it's stable. It's cosmic because it has to do with things like fate. Okay, these really big kind of grand concepts like life, death, fate, etc. It's structural because it actually spans the two books. Okay, without one or without understanding the context of the one, you would miss the irony that Homer is using here. It's situational because it directly contradicts Achilles' original intentions. Um, it's not really dramatic, and I wouldn't say that it's a verbal type of irony because here he's actually just stating his truth. Okay, but you see how it can be all three of these at the same time, and then also stable. So those are some types of irony, um, and hopefully that helps a little bit in making clear how those necessarily work. Um, we'll look at a couple paradoxes here. I didn't bring a lot of these in because I can't find my original notes, which is frustrating. They might actually be in Nassau. But paradoxes work similar to irony. Okay, they have a similar structure in that they are oppositional, but this is the main difference is not that something contradicts original intentions or a gential function, but rather that they directly contradict in meaning, so that a statement is both true and false at the same time. Oh, I forgot. Sorry. Um, I want to say it was Epimenides, if I'm remembering correctly. How does it go in Greek? I think it's I Crete Suste. So, I Crete Suste, which means all Cretans lie or are liars. Okay. Now, the joke here is that Epimenides was actually from Crete. This is what's called the liar's paradox. The liar's paradox you might have heard before. Sounds like this: the sentence I am saying to you right now is a lie. So if the sentence is true, then the sentence is false, and if the sentence is false, then the sentence is true. You see that it's both simultaneously true and false at the same time. Now, without going too far into that, I just want to make that note. I forgot to put Epimenides in there. There's a famous philosopher named Heraclitus who is very famous for his paradoxes, and you probably have heard at least this one before. You cannot step into the same river twice, right? Now, the rest of the quote is actually you as you are, and you as you are not. Now, what does it mean to say we can't step into the same river twice? Is that true or false? Well, you'd say like, oh, well, I can step in the same river twice. I mean, I do it every day for the rest of my life. And well, but is it the same river? Okay. Very often, these paradoxes work by amphiboly, which is a fancy way of saying ambiguity. Okay, ambiguity of meaning or definition. So when we say we cannot step in the same river twice, it's true and false at the same time. Because sure, we can step into the same river twice. I could go down to the Mississippi right now and jump right in, and I could do it tomorrow. But it's not the same river technically. So you see that there's this nice little ambiguity that allows for this paradox. Paradoxes can really only exist in language. There are some mathematical paradoxes that exist, but math as itself is a kind of language describing the world, right? Just as our language, made in words, describes the world for us. So paradoxes really are only a linguistic phenomenon. There's another set of very famous paradoxes called Zeno's paradoxes. You've probably maybe heard of this one. This is the most famous one. And it says this. So Achilles is going to race a tortoise, right? He doesn't think anything of it. He thinks, oh, no problem. I can beat a tortoise. No, easy. So he lets the tortoise get a head start. Now, Zeno says this. Well, in order for Achilles to catch that tortoise, he's got to at least get halfway. Because if I'm moving from point A to point B, there has to be a halfway point in which, or in between which, right, or through which I have to move. So let's say that this is the halfway point, this X, okay? Well, then Zeno says, well, but in between this X and where you started, isn't there a halfway point that you would have to reach in order to catch the tortoise? Well, yeah, I guess. And then a halfway point in between that, and a halfway point and a half. And then there's infinite regress, okay? An asymptotic regress through which Zeno goes to prove that, well, Achilles can't catch the tortoise. The argument is actually more about the idea of motion, but I won't get into that because that's for another lecture. So this was actually only solvable with the advent of calculus, oddly enough. Aristotle tried to solve these using language, and he failed. He couldn't quite get his mind around what Zeno was doing. So I want to now, in the last part of this lecture, so I don't go on too long, I just want to read this one poem and just kind of show you, kind of tease out a few themes, tease out a few levels of meaning, tease out some ironies, tease out at least a couple paradoxes from it, and then show you how, once again, just if we read a poem carefully and pay attention to how the poet is constructing meaning, then we can start to grow our understanding and vocabulary of how to discuss a poem as well as how to interpret it. So this poem by Dylan Thomas, he was a Welsh poet, lived a very short life, basically drank himself to death. It's a very lovely poem, and it's called A Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London. So I'm going to read through it, then I'm going to talk about some of the details, kind of show you some of the things that he's using in here, some of the themes, some of the images, etc. Try to talk about a little bit about how to interpret something like this. Thomas's language is very complex, and you can go and look at his other poems. They're very similar in tone, in language use to this one. This is not technically a formal poem, although he does use rhyme. He uses a relatively consistent rhyme scheme, okay? So making and breaking, flower, hour, darkness, harness, round sound, corn, morn, bead, seed, death, breath. See, this is an instance where looking at what an author is rhyming, okay? These two, death and breath, form a kind of irony. Truth and youth, we could even pull some meaning out of that. Murder and further, daughter, water, friends, Thames, mother, other. So the poem goes like this. Never until the mankind making, bird, beast, and flower, fathering in all humbling darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking, and the still hour is come of the sea tumbling in harness. And I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead, and the synagogue of the ear of corn. Shall I let prey the shadow of a sound, or sow my salt seed in the least valley of sackcloth to mourn the majesty and burning of the child's death? I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other. Now we see here, right away, we've got a kind of structural irony, right? Because he says this is a refusal, okay? Now, this is a rhetorical trope called, I should have written it out here. In the Latin, it's called occupatio. Oops. Can't spell today. It's called occupatio. And basically, it's a rhetorical trick that you use. It's actually very effective where you say, I'm not going to talk about this, but then you talk about it. So you'll see this sometimes in like court cases where somebody's on trial and maybe the opposing lawyer will say, look, it would be really easy for me to sit here and discuss with you the client's alcoholism, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to mention how many drinks he had every morning before going to work, stuff like that, where you're talking about it, but you're claiming that you're not. So he refuses. He says, refusal to mourn. But then this poem itself does mourn the death of this child. And in the context of when he published this was published in 1944. Okay. So it's clearly in toward the end of the Second World War. You might have heard a couple words like synagogue in there, which we'll discuss here in a bit. But so he says, I'm not going to do it, and does it. Okay, that forms a structural irony between the title and the poem itself. Even right here at the opening, never until. Now that's paradoxical, because when you say something never is going to happen, never, right? That means that it's the instance of it happening is not to be. Now, to say that something happened until something, right? That indicates that up until a point, it hasn't happened, but will eventually. So he opens up with this kind of what's called a solecism. And that's an ungrammatical usage of language, okay? So we call it a solecism, but the solecism that he's using here intentionally is paradoxical, okay? I want to go through and point to some of the moments in the poem before I go in and kind of like explain it. So here, these ands, and, this is all one sentence, okay? Up until child's death. That's all one sentence, because that's the first period we get in the poem. So this and, that's called polysyndeton. And that is where you are connecting phrases together with and, okay? So if you said something like, if you go to the store, get me a hat and a new glass and a new cup and a new shirt. So instead of putting commas in between them, if you said and, that's called polysyndeton. Here, fathering in all humbling darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking. And we can't tell, darkness can't tell silence. You see, so to speak silence, right? That's an ambiguity, okay? Very ambiguous. And the still hours come to see tumbling in harness. Now, you notice that the language in here all of a sudden turns from this kind of chthonic or protean type of language. We have Zion, we have synagogue, we have corn, we have sackcloth, we have even valley, okay? Now, all of those, all that language sounds ecumenical. It sounds religious. Okay. Um, uh, in fact, Zion and synagogue, right, are specifically Jewish. And remember, in 1944, people were starting to learn more and more about what was happening in Germany to the Jews. And so this is a clear reference to the Holocaust, even though, right, he's dropping that language in reference to a child who died during the fire bombings, okay, of London. So he drops that in there and he creates a kind of illusion. Okay. Here we have majesty and burning of the child's death. Now, why is that ironic? Why is it ironic? Well, because to be magisterial is to be good, right? And yet burning to death, bad. So you see that the language used here creates this kind of irony, this structural structure of irony. It's not structural irony, it's more verbal. But you can see there these contrastive words, okay? Then we have our first end stop right here. Now, why is that important? Well, we don't have any other use of punctuation until bam, child's death. It stops us at that moment, okay? As if to reflect, as if to draw emphasis to the subject of the poem. Here, I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth. Here, obviously, we have a double entendre. A grave truth, right, simply means a very serious truth, but it also, right, through the double entendre, references a physical grave. Stations of the breath, that's an allusion. So instead of stations of the cross, okay, we have stations of the breath. Now you'll see that Thomas does this quite often in a lot of his poems, where he'll take religious sounding language and he'll twist them. He'll twist it into something that is still religious, still holds some of that religious connotation. But then usually he'll turn it into something more of like a natural image, almost like a druidic image, okay? Here we have another end stop, elegy of innocence and youth. Bam, stops it. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we get end stop, end stop, end stop, end stop, end stop. So you see that the last stanza of this poem is overemphasizing these end stops. Now we could look at that as perhaps the poem in its final stanza, right, adding these end stops as if to indicate a certain finality, a certain end, as if to call attention to its own ending, you see. And then we have period here, period here. So there's only what? One, blah, 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 blah. 2, 3, 4. So there's only 4 sentences technically in this poem. And that's something that I think is quite important. So to go back and look at this. Never until the mankind making bird, beast, and flower, fathering and all humbling darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking, and the still hour is come of the sea tumbling in harness. How do we make sense of that? Because it's clearly referential to things, but, and this is where poetry gets tricky, because it's not specifically saying exactly what it means, right? Because it's evoking these ideas and images, right? It's very hard to kind of pin down exactly what it is that Thomas is doing here. And what I would argue is that what he's doing is he's playing a kind of irony of using clearly religious words or words with religious connotations, but he's shifting them ever so slightly into an almost pagan kind of setting, a pagan kind of tone. When we talk about the darkness, right, and light, even the hour, the sea, these kind of broad, natural kind of metaphors and allusions, and he plays those against, right, the religious sounding or ecumenical sounding words like Zion, synagogue, sackcloth, etc. And I must enter again the round Zion of the water beat in the synagogue of the ear of corn. Shall I let pray the shadow of a sound, right? Shall I shall I even dare to speak, right? So you remember a refusal. The poem is uncertain up until this point. Shall I say anything about it? Shall I sow my salt seed? Cry, so the tear itself. In the least valley of sackcloth. We have here just so many ambiguities, certain ironies, like sowing a salt seed. Now, clearly, a salt seed does not exist, okay? But that idea of fecundity, right? And why I say this is almost like a pagan-esque type of poem or chthonic. I'll write that word out here. Oops. Chthonic, so C-H-T-H, which is refers to like the ground. It's a very old word, comes from the Greek. Basically, it just means, like right now, it would just mean, something subterranean, something to do with the earth, caves, stuff like that. But it was actually a reference to an earlier pantheon of gods, right? That kind of predate the Greek gods that we're familiar with. So the chthonic gods gave rise to this. But this idea of earth as the place where we put, right, our dead, but from the earth comes life. And so you have that paradox going on in this poem, okay? Thomas is using these paradoxes, and I think in a very, very interesting way. Shall I speak? Shall I cry in this least valley of sackcloth? Sackcloth is something that you would wear while in mourning, okay? To mourn the majesty and burning of the child's death, right? I shall not murder the mankind of her going. Now, obviously she's dead, so there's a certain irony here because, you can't murder that which is already dead. But the mankind of her going, shall I degrade her dying with a grave truth, right? Or shall I blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth? Well, here what he's talking about is the idea that we might see like a politician, come out and say, let's mourn this child. Let's all gather around and use this as a rallying cry, etc. Right? And Thomas is kind of, well, I guess the speaker, I should say. The speaker here seems, it's snowing outside right now. Great. Not again. Well, you guys can't see it, but trust me, it's starting to snow here, and I'm upset. But no, it's about glorifying something. It's about trying to avoid using that language, right, of mourning somebody, of mourning something, at the risk of becoming sentimental, at the risk of perhaps getting it wrong, at the risk of perhaps something like that being used as propaganda, you see. And so that's part of this refusal. It's not that it didn't bother him. It's not that it's not a sad thing, okay? But very often those tragedies, those things like a child dying in a bombing raid, right, can be used as propaganda, okay? So people who don't necessarily care that a human being has died, rather they see an opportunity, right, to rally the troops or whatever, okay? and this idea of the elegy of innocence and youth, because this would be that maudlin, saccharine type of political speech that you might see somebody use. Okay. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter. And this is what I mean about that, like, almost pagan and chthonic type of language. Robed in the long friends, grains beyond age, dark veins of her mother. This kind of chthonic, dark, earthy sense of death and fecundity, right? That very, very core old sense of the earth is the place where the dead go, but also the place from which life comes. There's a circle to it. Call it the circle of life. Okay. Secret by the unhidden, by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. Okay. The Thames, the water itself here, this one line is not end stopped. Why? Because, well, maybe the Thames, nature itself, doesn't mourn, does it? Right? Nature itself is incapable. Human beings are the only things capable of mourning. Actually, elephants are too, in a way, but I won't go into that. After the first death, there is no other. Now, this, once again, to play on this ambiguity, okay, I don't want to go on too much longer because this video is already a bit long. Just to make this clear. After the first death, there is no other. How do you read that? Do you see that you could read it in a Christian sense, that you die once and then there's a resurrection? Okay, so there is no other death. It's kind of like John Donne, in death thou shalt die, that sort of thing. But there's also this kind of chthonic and pagan sense of this last line. Because if we take it away from that Christian valence in which Thomas is clearly placing it, he's placing it there on purpose, right? If we take it in a pagan sense, after the first death there is no other, and it adds a certain level of dignity to the death of this girl, because, well, once you die, you can't suffer anymore, right? And so it adds a certain level of pathos, emotional resonance, dignity to this girl's death. And so therefore, by the end of this poem, you see that, well, a refusal to mourn the death by fire of a child in London is itself ironic, because he says, I refuse, and then he does it. Okay? So you see that there are just, and that was a brief kind of run through of this poem. There's a lot more going on in it that I simply didn't have time to elucidate. But you see that over and over and over, line to line to line, right? He's laying in ambiguities, paradoxes. He's using these rhetorical tricks, okay, like polysyndeton would be part of the oratory rhetoric. Occupatio is a structure of rhetoric. He lays in all of this religious language, but clearly it's not like a devotional religious language. But he's still using it, okay, because it still has a lot of power, has a lot of resonance. He's using his end stops very, very carefully here. He has a very specific rhyme scheme and these variations in the lines. And then, like I said, we have this ambiguity here at the end about this lovely and terrifying and comforting, in a way, last line. So I hope that helps a little bit by kind of clarifying a little bit of what irony does, what paradoxes look like, and then to kind of show you how these ambiguities, paradoxes, and ironies can function as we're reading through a poem. And a really lovely poem, and I do hope that this inspires you to go out and read a little bit more of Dylan Thomas's work. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. He is a really, really amazing poet, and died tragically far too young. So thank you, and have a lovely day.